Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our Art and Science Cafe this evening with Dr. Herman Haller. My name is
Hey.
Jerry Bowers. Oh, can you hear me? My name is Jerry Bowers, and I am very excited about this evening's presentation. So Dr. Haller is going to share with us some cabinets of science and curiosity. So a wonderful way to look at how Renaissance era folks were trying to categorize and collect and understand our world. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how some of those same principles apply today as we do science here at the MDI Biological Laboratory and around the world. So I think many of you know Dr. Haller, but I will just remind you that he is the president of the MDI Biological Laboratory. He is a physician scientist. He also has an appointment at Hanover Medical School in Hanover, Germany, and he is a passionate art historian. So, Dr. Haller, welcome. We're excited to hear your presentation this evening.
Thank you, Terry, for the nice introduction. And yes, we'll talk about cabinets of science and curiosity. And we will talk about how science is organized. And you can already see on the first slide that it's not really organized at all. I mean, when you look at this, you immediately want to, where's the dust? How can I organize it? I mean, could I have a drawer and put everything in there so to get it a little bit more clean? And to be honest, this is what science is all about. I mean, we are trying to understand things, we are trying to bring things in order, but during the process of science, it looks terribly disorderly. So what you see here is a painting by Franz Franken. This is a painting from Antwerp. Franz Franken worked in Antwerp, and when you remember my last lecture, so we talk a lot about the 16th century and historical background. Antwerp was in the beginning of the 16th century the leading center of commerce in Europe, and then Amsterdam took over out of several reasons. We won't go into that again. And this is from Antwerp. And here you see a typical example. And since it was painted and the paintings were sold expensively, you can see a representation of what a collection looked like. And this collection, as I said, seems to us more like what a child would collect. But what they did is they wanted to make and generate a microcosm of the world. And there are a couple of very fascinating aspects that, yes, they had, you can see these shells, and you can see porcelain, you can see in some of them flowers, but you also see paintings in there. And then you see objects like this little seahorse nailed to the wall. So it was a demonstration of the richness of the world. And there were many of these objects. And when you look at our work, this is science from the lab. Part of this has been in our exhibition of last year, which is still up there. It also looks rather disorganized. It looks complicated. At least on the other one, we were able to recognize a couple of things because we are more familiar with them. But here it's disorganized, and I'll try to explain a little bit how this all started in the 16th century, what it means for us, and whether we can draw any lessons from that. So that's another one. Also, Franz Franken, so you can see he made a business out of that, and there was a whole school. And I, as an art historian, I find it very interesting that we are not looking at these paintings a lot these days, but this was an established genre at the time. And there were other genres like witchcraft, for instance, which was on the same level, but we don't consider to be serious paintings at all. So as I mentioned last time, the past is a different country. They do things differently, and they definitely looked at things differently. And this is what we're going to talk about. You can see here the flower still life, and you can also see why Franz Franken is so famous because his flower still lives were also extraordinary. A third one, and I think with that you have been introduced to a variety. You can see that a couple of features come back again. Here we have the seahorse, but then we have drawings actually at the wall. On the left hand, a Holy Family. On the right hand side, there are other animals and flowers and insects. You can see that the shells were a regular part of the collection, but you can see also letters. You see other things which you haven't seen before. And here, all of a sudden, it looks like a trompe l'oeil painting, and it is because it's a chicken, and you can have a glass of wine and the chicken. There is always in these paintings on the right-hand side a window which is opening to the real world. We're still in a painting, but it gives you the whole picture. We are collecting from the real world outside. We have it all in front of us, and now we are trying to organize it. So in the real world, this were mostly a room. And I've shown you this picture in my this painting in my last lecture, because to be honest, it's one of the few where we have two professors doing science within one of these cabinets. So this is also from Franz Franken, 1617. So 20 years earlier than the others, an art cabinet with Abraham Ortelius, famous map maker. He actually made the first map of the world in the 16th century. In Justus Lipsius, he's the one with the brown beard sitting there, famous philosopher and professor, first in Leiden and then in Leuven in Belgium. And we have talked about the still life and last time. But this is what they did is they discussed these objects of art, science, and curiosity. Just to give you an overview, these are the cabinets of science and curiosity in Europe we know about, and they were famous, and people traveled there. I will not go into the details where they all are. This is information you can get from me when you travel to Europe the next time. You can go there, or as you will see at the end of my lecture, you can travel to Houston, Texas, where you can find another cabinet of curiosity, which looks like the old times, but it's more modern. So we have quite a few of them. And one of the first things I want to discuss is how did this collection actually works? Is how do you collect all this? And for that, I'll show you examples what it looked like. This is the first one where we have a drawing from. So this is from Ferrante Imperato. This is in Naples in Italy, also one of the important cities at the time. And Ferrante Imperato, you'll see this on the next one. Here is a portrait of him with a flower and with a book and with stones. So he was interested in nature. On the left-hand side, you see a guide. And this is one of several editions because people traveled there to have a look at all that. When you look at this, it's mind-boggling. I mean, you all immediately recognize the crocodile. And to be honest, I think you have to have a crocodile on the ceiling of a cabinet of curiosity and science. But then you see birds there, you see cabinets full of stones, of all sorts of artifacts. You see boxes in there, you see books in there. Very interesting. The books are not like in our libraries, they are more protected, but everything is full. And the first question is why, how, and then the question is, how do you organize this? And hopefully we'll go and answer a couple of these questions during the talk. You may also wonder about the dogs running around there and whether Ferrante had a couple of dogs and whether he was interested, because we know that at least they had drawings of dogs. So this is Ferrante Imperato. That's, as I mentioned, the guide for his book. And you can see this is 1599. That's 100 years after he had started this studiolo of curiosity and science. This is another one. This is not in Italy. This is in Denmark. This is from the scientist is Ole Worms. He's a medical doctor, and his collection was also famous. And here you look at all these wonders of nature, and you can see not only the fish hanging from the ceiling, but you can see all sorts of other animals. And the variability of all these chambers of curiosity. And now you understand why they're called chambers of curiosity, because first of all, you think, well, they collected everything they found curious or interesting, and it didn't matter. However, they collected things in order to understand nature and in order to make sense out of it all. And you also understand why this is all of a sudden became much more important in the 16th century, because this is the century when all these wonderful things from the New World, from the Americas, came rolling in. So Asia and America contributed, and all of a sudden the question was, if we have all these continents, it's not these isolated places in Europe. How do we make sense of the whole world? And what is the relationship of us, Europe, with the rest of the world? Number three is a famous example which doesn't exist anymore. This is Athanasius Kircher, famous in his days. He spoke 7 languages. He was working on mathematics. He actually wrote the first book deciphering the hieroglyphs. He got it all wrong, totally wrong, but nonetheless, he was an inventor of languages. He wrote discussions about understanding the world, and he had a huge collection which he had inherited from a rich man in Rome. This is somewhere some of you may have already been to. This is the Studiolo of Francesco I, a Medici Duke in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. But most likely you have stopped in front of the Palazzo Vecchio and looked at the Michelangelo, and then you went over at the Loggia dei Lanzi and looked at the sculptures there. But this Studiolo is fascinating because this is where all, we can't see them anymore, but we can see the paintings, all his secrets were. And on the right-hand side, you can see the Duke himself making alchemy. And as I said before, we are used to take out of all these wonders and curiosities only the part which are now science, as we call it, and we leave the rest there. And this is true for a lot of what happened in the 16th and 17th century, that our history is only what we claim from there, which is more mathematical and which is more organized and structured, and we leave all the crap to the old age. This is what history does. We have seen this before. This is the Botanical Garden at Leiden, but the Cabinet of Curiosity was in the back of the garden, and here you see the crocodile again. So the crocodile and bats, and you see the tortoise, so the turtle. So this were all fascinating objects. And then last not least, this is a private person. This is Rembrandt, the painter, and this is the Cabinet of Science and Curiosity at his house. And this is what you can see today. And here, I think you already realize, I think the crocodile is hanging there from the ceiling because it's now a commonplace that you need a crocodile hanging from the ceiling if you have a cabinet of curiosity. This is all reconstructed from his auction records because he got bankrupt. And some of you have heard a lecture from me about Rembrandt and about anatomy of Dr. Tulp. So he got bankrupt because I think he invested wrongly, but he got also bankrupt because he was collecting all this stuff. He couldn't help it. He bought at auctions for a lot of money all this stuff to collect it and then to paint it. You may remember from our last talk, there was this shell which he painted, which is famous, and this is from this collection. To be honest, after he got bankrupt in 1648, he started collecting immediately afterwards. He didn't have any money. He just couldn't help it. You had to have all this stuff in order to paint it. So collecting has to do with money. The more money you have, the more you can collect. And to be honest, the combination of having money and being curious, that's terrible. And I'll give you one story of Jakob Fugger. Jacob Fugger, 1459 to 1525, he was called The Rich by Albrecht Dürer. The painting is from 1518 and it's in Augsburg and it's a wonderful portrait. Now, this is the richest man in 1520 of the whole planet. You'll see this in a moment. He had so much money and he made this from lending money. As always, bankers get rich. He had mines of gold and he had mines of copper. So it's metals. And we know these days that metals are valuable and all that. He was able to support the election of Charles V in 1524 with more than 1 billion in our money to bribe the dukes to get him elected. And he lent him the money, but he got in reward for that the rights of almost everything. Half the gold from Mexico, from Montezuma, went into the pockets of Jakob Fugger. He lived in Augsburg. You can see this when you travel there in southern Germany, quite a city. That's the town hall of the city, and that's one of the churches. And it was a center of commerce and finance in Central Europe about 1500. Here you see Jakob Fugger and his accountant at the Fugger headquarters because they ran an empire. This is the Fondaco dei Tedeschi in Venice. This is where the Fuggers built the house. You can see it in the center next to the Rialto Bridge. And this is one of their offices. This shows you their offices throughout Europe. And this was not only for commercial, this was also about information. They had a newspaper circulating, and you can see they were also in Mexico and Peru and what we call Chile these days, and the Philippines, in Nigeria and India. This is all one family, and they are running all this business. They had a newspaper circulating there, and they collected from all these offices. Their accountants were obliged to send interesting stuff to Augsburg because they were collectors. And they put this all together in their collection. Not the next generation, but the generation after Jacob was Johann Jacob Fugger. That's a painting from Christoph Amberger in 1541. Now, he is the generation which is not making money but spending it. But he had an excellent education. You can see here he was fluent in several languages. He wrote 2 history books and he edited more than 60 books. I have a list here of his college buddies, which shows you very nicely the networking started very early in his life. So there is a translator of Greek texts, which was difficult at the time. The tutor of Elizabeth I was a good friend of him and visited regularly in his house in Augsburg. The Duke of Parma, who was the governor of the Netherlands, never forgot about the time they spent together at university. the governor of Augsburg, the bishop of Augsburg, the chancellor of Bavaria, they were all close friends of his, and all the money and collecting. So a very educated man. Unfortunately, he was not like his great uncle, who was the richest man in Europe. He went bankrupt. 5 years after he had taken over the company, he was bankrupt. And then he sold the whole collection to the Duke of Bavaria at the time. And here you can see what the Duke of Bavaria built for this whole collection. And you can see a little bit on the right-hand side what was left. And he started a new career. To be honest, I think he was a scientist and a humanist all his life. And it was just by chance that he got so much money from the family. He started a new career as builder of a large cabinet of curiosities at the court in Munich. He did this not all by himself. He had very important help. This is a famous painting by Titian, which is in Vienna in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. Jacopo Strada, he was an art dealer, and he moved actually to Munich to work together with the Fuggers to build this collection and organize the collection. And the organizer was Samuel Quickeberg, who also moved to Munich and then died in Munich in 1567. And he wrote the first book about how to organize a collection. So I think I've given you now an overview. And while you are looking at these curiosity shops, and you thought, give me a break, I'm not really interested in that. This gives you an idea. This was serious. This was about money, lots of money. And it was also serious about organizing it and get a better understanding of the work. So here we come back to this. This is what the Fuggers, what they tried to organize. And now we'll talk about that this was a serious task. You have met this man, Ulisse Aldrovandi, last time already. And we talked about his collection of plants, and we were talking about the drawings. I mentioned this a little bit, but here I'm quoting in his collection 18,000 different things. We may have 18,000 different things in our houses, but we haven't counted them. And then 7,000 are dried and pasted, and 3,000 of them were painted as alive. You may remember that he has a whole group of painters painting all the stuff. So making these cabinets of curiosity into cabinets of science, a lot of effort. The rest are animals, rare earths, petrified sap, stones, marble, rocks, and metals. Ask yourself, do you actually want to go there? And people traveled and had to look at that. But then he gets organized. They can be seen in 14 cupboards, which I call my pinacoteca. Also 66 armoires. I don't think we have that many at home. And in these armoires, he had 4,500 pigeonholes where he put the stuff in. And then marked with their names so that they can be found. So this is what it means when you organize a cabinet of curiosity. And this is why it was a huge task, and I'll show you this again. You have seen this before, huge task to organize these. And they did this by making drawings. Here you can already see a serious scientific effort in the 16th century. This is 250 years before our now existing classification took place. And they tried in a way which is different from how we think about it to organize the work. Here you see mushrooms on the left-hand side and birds and insects together. So they use these drawings as science. These are visual databases. These are flexible research instruments. So they are not in books. They are isolated drawings. And when you sit there, remember the two professors we have seen before in this painting, you order them in a different fashion. You meet with your friends, you have scientific discussions, and then all of a sudden you change the order. And somebody says, well, I think this mushroom actually looks like one of the insects. So why don't we group the mushrooms with the insect? And the other says, no, 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 these are plants. You understand? The insects are living animals. No, they are not animals. They are born. And then all of a sudden they are in a discussion about where do these insects actually come from, which was one of the large puzzles there. They organized this is important, in a non-monotonic logic. They had flexible criteria and they were changing their criteria. And this is a very important lesson when we look at the past, that we understand we are using criteria, we are using a logic which is in a way monotonic because we are much better organized, but this is not the only way we can look at things. And this becomes important. Here you see these beautiful examples. So there is a lot of aesthetic quality in there as well, as we have aesthetic quality in our research, and I'll show you this in a moment. And you have seen this already before. These are the first efforts to categorize. So on the left-hand side, we have tables and we have diagrams. Now, this almost looks like what we are doing. This is what you look at when you have done a single cell analysis. Now, this is not that far away from the first Franken painting I've shown you. I mean, we definitely do not understand what this all means. But the scientists, they have to bring order to that. So we sit there and we rearrange data. Oh, this plot here, this dark green, doesn't it, if we move it a little bit, what we see here is different cells based on the expression of thousands of different genes in these cells. And then AI is making this up based on the similarity of the gene expression. They are making these differently colored clouds. And then we sit there and we look at this and we rearrange data. We are finding new criteria. We are developing systems which make sense out of this. And I can tell you this is an ongoing discussion. I am a little bit old-fashioned. I still think that science is a hypothesis, and then you test your hypothesis rigidly, and then you come up with results, and this is science. We had a scientist here 2 years ago, I remember this vividly, who said on stage, Dr. Haller, give me a break. I look at these data, I rearrange them. This gives me some thoughts, and then I make a hypothesis out of the data I look at. So he's more like Ulisse Altrovandi in the 16th century. And I'm a little bit in between, like 1890 or something like this. But the new science with all the data, and it becomes more complex. And here you see how we try to make sense out of that. And actually, this is something our scientists at MD Heidelberg can explain to you, because this is now not the gene expression. These are the proteins which are made from these genes. And we have scientists explaining to us that this process, where we once thought it's a one-way street, is now much more complicated. So the proteins and the genes, they are different levels. Now imagine this. I've shown you the last one and this one. And this is a map using these new techniques for finding out the patterns of diseases in humans. I don't want to go into details, but it gives you an impression, and I hope it's convincing, or you have to ask me critical questions about this, that when you look at things, when you look at nature, and you try to come up with diagrams, that the diagrams on the right hand, these are the explanations of what we have on the left hand side, or at least some explanation. Well, to be honest, doesn't help that much, does it? And this is a nice example because it's related to our work. This is when you then compare different speeches or different, this is males and females with these networks. You can immediately see there are huge differences. Now, this is our way in 2025 to explain the world. But as I said, it's not that different from what they did there. You have to look at things, you have to watch things, and then you have to come up with clever ideas how to arrange things. And then you test this, and hopefully it all makes sense in the end. So I've already talked about that, that the of the ultraviolet, but you may wonder, what are these armoires? What are these cupboards like? And I can tell you they are very special. So this started actually in books. They organized this in books. This is a print from the 17th century, and they had these different cupboards, and these are the pigeonholes he's talking about. And I've already mentioned this guy. You don't have to read this book, and I don't think a lot of people have read it over the last 100 years. But here in the background of this painting by Peter Paul Rubens and Jan Bruegel, this is a wonderful painting which is in the Prado in Madrid, The Sense of Sight. So this tells you what you can see when you actually are able to use your eyes and your brains. And on the left-hand side, you see one of these armoires. And when we go to museums and have a look at these, this is at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, a cabinet of curiosity made around 1634 collections like what we just described. And what I find fascinating about these is not only the richness with wood and with paintings and with metal, so they are by themselves cabinets of curiosity, but then they are filled. And what I wonder is, how do you organize that? When you're at home and you organize your own stuff, you come up with new ideas all the time. And this is the same here. So when a friend comes by, a scientific friend, you open these cupboards and, oh my God, what you've got there. And can I have a look at the others? And then the question, why do you put these things together? Why are they on the same side of this? So this was made in Augsburg by a famous family, the Heinhofer family. There are various woods, bone, marble, copper, textile, ivory, gemstones, glass, silver, and paper. And now we are back to money. So this is one of the most famous cabinets. This was given in the middle of the century to the King of Sweden. I don't know whether you're aware, the middle of the 17th century, the Swedes are one army invading Europe, fighting the emperor, the Catholic emperor in Vienna. And during that time, just to have more friendly relationships with him, Heinhofer makes this cabinet and sent it to Sweden. The king actually didn't see it because he was killed in one of the battles in the middle of Europe. But nonetheless, it's still in Uppsala. It's still one of the most famous objects they have in Sweden. It was very expensive. And on the right-hand side, you can see Philip Heinhofer. This shows you the event. This is not Sweden, but this is another one of these cabinets, which was handed over to Philip II, the Archduke of Pomerania. And ironically, this painting is actually part of the cabinet. So this tells you it's not only about science and art, it's also about history. And the whole combination of this is, as I said, from the past and a different logic. This one you have seen on the right-hand side. I apologize for that. On the left-hand side, This is also Augsburg 1660. And here I show you a detail of one of these cabinets of curiosity. This one is not from Naples, but it's in the museum in Naples. And you can see how delicate this is, all ivory. These were made. So all of a sudden, the structure, the background for all the science, because they are only made for the precious different objects, all of a sudden becomes art itself. So this gives you an overview about cabinets of science and curiosity. And then in the 18th century, we had a divide. So order and structure became more mathematics. It became different orders, and curiosity and wonder went out of science. Not completely, but the way we look at science now these days, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is much too unstructured. So we expect from science, and quite rightly so, that it provides us with order and structure, with understanding what's going on. And curiosity and wonder is left to paintings like this or to more famous scientists. So this is Albert Einstein. I don't know anything. The only thing I know is that I'm curious. And this is why I found these astonishing things. And then closer to home, Richard Feynman, whom I admire very much. Nobody ever figures out what life is all about. And it doesn't matter. Explore the world. Nearly everything is really interesting if you go into it deeply enough. By the way, Elon Musk should read his books because he was the one who figured out the rocket problem just with his mind and thinking about it. In art, curiosity was kept on the other side. So this is definitely not science. This is Salvador Dali. And these are the paintings where the curiosity, where the meeting, the unexpected meeting of different objects. And this was part of the original story of the cabinets of curiosity and science. This is where the curiosity remained in art. And a famous sentence is that art is really the unexpected meeting of two very different objects in one space. And I won't go into a lot of details, but I'd like to show you one famous example, and this is Joseph Cornell. He is definitely not from Naples in Italy, and he was not exposed to all these things. He was born in New York State. He lived in New York City all his life. He never moved out of New York City, and he made all this in New York City just looking at all these wonders of nature. And he put together in his artwork, and the artwork is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City and in other famous places, he put together things like this. So this is more like the Franken painting, and I'm sure that Joseph Cornell knew about these. So these are real objects put together, and I'm sure he knew about Heinhofer. And I'm also sure, like others, Marcel Duchamp, they were very good in science, but they were more interested in the curiosity of these things, of the unexpectedness. And to be honest, this is what science is also about. When we find in our experiments the unexpected, we have to have open eyes for that. I realize this very often that we forget about the unexpected things. We are so concentrating on the things we already know about, and we are just looking for confirmation in our experiment. And this is what science is all about. So I'm not against that, but to have an open mind and to find new things out of that, look at that. This is cabinets of curiosity from the MoMA. He died in 1972, is famous for that. And you can see all the things we talked about, organizing the numbers, names, different objects, unexpected findings, and you can see the cupboard. Not 7,500, not even 3,500, but the concept is the same. You bring together these things and you find novel things. And this is, I like this a lot. This is Houston, Museum of Natural Science. They actually had listened to my lecture before. They have a crocodile hanging from the ceiling. So kids can immediately see I am in a cabinet of curiosity. And that's the Museum of Natural Science in Houston. And you can see that you can still discover the world when you look at all these things. But as I said before, it raises curiosity in children, but we should keep some of the curiosity for ourselves. So I've shown you this before. And I'm sure Richard Feynman would have enjoyed to meet this Fugger, who ruined the family and was the collector of the family and organizing all these things. And this is what Richard Feynman did as well. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you'll join us in the pleasure of finding things out at MDIBR.
Dr. Haller, this is fantastic. Thank you. I think you may have just saved my marriage because now when my husband complains about all the random things that I collect, I can just show him this recording and he will understand. This
I'm
is
fully with
wonderful.
you. I will be a witness if you need.
That's great. So if you want to stop sharing your screen, maybe we'll bring everyone together and we can have a little Q&A session and folks can ask questions or make comments that they would like to do. So if you have a question or a comment for Dr. Haller, if you want to just, whoops, now I'm the only one on the screen. There we go. If you want to ask a question, just raise your hand. You can take yourself off mute and we'll be more than happy to have a conversation with you.
You realize these were all hypotheses. Challenge me.
Challenge me, yeah. This is great. I loved it. I thought it was really fun. Dr. Haller, where did, in the sort of Renaissance period, I mean, where were they getting all of these things? You mentioned auctions, like what was the typical way that someone was collecting all these random, where do you find a crocodile?
Yeah, you bought it, and I mentioned this last time. When all the ships were coming in, for instance, Middelburg, when we talked about the flower stills, people rowed out to them. So in the Netherlands, it was more capitalistic. You could buy it directly. In Spain, for instance, it was all confiscated by the crown, and then the crown first analyzed whether it's patentable or not, and then it went on to auction. So there were different ways. You can imagine that cities like Venice, so the Fuggers had this Fondaco dei Tedeschi there. So lots of things are coming in from Asia, and then, but also locally. They did expeditions. They went into the mountains and they collected all sorts of things they found there, and they found rare stones, and then they brought this back, and then it was collected. And you can imagine what a difficult decision. What do I throw away
Mhm.
and what do I keep it? You have to compare. Oh, I have now 6 of these stones. Are they all the same? Or when I look at them more carefully. So this is really the fun of it, to generate the world and the microcosm. So it was expeditions, it was trade. There was an exchange between scientists and between the collectors. So actually, when you visited somebody, you brought something from your own collection and back and forth. So there were several ways, and the more money you had and the more interested you were, the more you got. There were role models like Ferdinand II in Prague. He spent almost all the money he had on cabinets and on finding these things. And they also were interested in medicine. They were interested especially in making gold. So alchemy is part of that. And they were interested in poison. So the Medici were famous for making the best poisons in killing their enemies rapidly.
Great. Timur, go
I,
ahead.
yeah, I have a question, but it's a little more contemporary. Tell me a little bit more about Richard Feynman. And I asked the question because as a first year university physics student, he was the inspiration to um, really study physics with serious interest.
Yeah. So Richard Feynman is really one of my heroes. I mean, most of all because the sentence "the pleasure of finding things out," which is the title of one of his books, is just so wonderful. So he was a physicist, very young in Los Alamos. He was known at the time that he could break into every safe, and he describes this very nicely how he figured that out. So it was a mixture of really watching over the shoulders of others and combination things. And then he went to California. He was at the California Institute of Technology, and I had the pleasure of having lunch there. And was an exhibition on art and science in California a couple of months ago. And they are still very proud of him. And what I mentioned about the rocket problem, you remember the catastrophe when the Saturn exploded and they couldn't figure out why. And then they called him in, and he was the one, by diligently sorting through all the possibilities, who discovered that there was a small plastic ring. And this plastic ring, when the temperature was low, cracked. And at the morning, when the Saturn was supposed to start, it was very cold. And they hadn't taken this into consideration. So he solved this problem where they had, you can imagine, after this disaster, lots of scientists around just by thinking a little bit outside of the box and looking at the problem itself. And I find this very admirable.
I guess I would just comment that his lectures on physics, the sort of introductory book, was so interesting because it was both accessible to a first year university student, but without any compromise of the depth and complexity that it led to. And that maybe is a lot like a cabinet of curiosity.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So he's, and interestingly enough, he's also the hero of our bioinformatics person, Joel Graber. Thinks,
Ah,
That's amazing. Barb, do you have a question?
Maybe I'll ask my question.
Yes.
Oops, you're still on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, I was wondering a little more about the cabinets that you showed us. And were they usually built for an existing collection, or people obtained those or planned them based on what they hoped to get? Or was there a design to them? They kind of reminded me, actually, as you were showing us, we got a trunk from India that we thought was going to be a basic trunk for some storage, but we could use it, in a coffee table kind of fashion. It had drawers and openings and little pockets all over the place that we had no idea about from the description. And so it sort of reminded me of that. And we've managed to fill all of those. And so, like Jerry, I need one of these curiosity cabinets. But so how were they planned? Do you know? Is it known?
yeah, it's a very good question. So we don't know, actually. We don't know whether when Heinhofer was starting making these, whether he got first a description of the collection and then he started to make this. Heinhofer didn't do this by himself. He had a company. So you can imagine he had woodcutters, he had everything he needed goldsmiths, painters, people working on these. So it was a whole factory. He got rich of this. So he himself is more a merchant of these cabinets of curiosity. They're still associated with his name. But I, I would guess because they're so richly decorated that it was after a while more about decoration. And it was only, but it was mostly in the 17th century. In the 18th century, the cabinets changed. They are much taller. They have actually glass doors, so you can see what's in there. And a lot of the specimens were then in alcohol, so it was more becoming more scientific than before when everything was lying around. So you had to put it somewhere because the collections grew. But your specific question about whether there's a plan which has to do with the collection, I doubt it, because I don't think that he got the information from Sweden
Yeah.
about their collection.
Yeah.
But it's an excellent question. What is the plan when you build such a thing, or
Yeah.
when you
And they
do?
each one looked very different, and maybe that was your design in showing them. But maybe there were, like now we can buy cabinets of different styles, and there may have been a standard kind of plan at different periods in time. I don't
Yeah.
know.
We can have a little bit of an idea. I showed you this one. There are many more examples of this drawing or the woodcut where you saw that it was organized like this. So it started like this. You first put it into order, into rectangles, which I find very interesting. So, for instance, the garden in Leiden is in rectangles. They could have done all sorts of things, but they made rectangles, and then they translated these rectangles into books, and then they filled these rectangles, and then from there they went to drawers and to these cabinets.
Fascinating. Harold, go ahead.
Thanks.
You're still muted, Harold.
Can't get it? Oh, shoot. All right, well, let Stephen go. Maybe you can still work on it.
These examples of collecting in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries are all men. And I'm wondering, do you think it's the case that there were women involved in any of this collecting and organizing, but we don't hear about it? Or
Yeah, very much so. I'm sorry. I mean, I should have thought about that, but unfortunately, the women we know about are more 18th century or around 1700. So this is a lame excuse. Yes, there were. I mean, we showed last time when we discussed the still lifes that some of the most famous still life painters were women. And I mentioned last time that I think that it's a 19th century invention that women were painting flowers, so they are less costly and not valuable because the still lifes from the women in Amsterdam were more expensive than Rembrandt's at the time. A famous example is Rachel Ruiz. She is Dutch. Her father was a famous professor, and he was a collector of monstrosities, and he is famous for anatomy. And she collected and she painted. And there are quite a few examples. I'll bring a book over tomorrow, 17th century of a Dutch woman. So I think it has a lot to do that women were forgotten or perhaps left out because of the way we collected in the 19th century. We all of a sudden made this hierarchy of paintings, which comes from the 17th century. I know that, but that history paintings or landscapes are more important than cabinets of curiosity or witchcraft paintings. They were not en vogue in the big museums.
All right, good to know.
Harold, it looks like you're off mute.
Yes, thank
There
you.
you go. You found it.
I'm just curious about the earlier images from the 16th century, where there was a combination of artworks and natural history examples. At what point does a cabinet of curiosity, or does it ever happen where there's a differentiation between just odd things, materials, versus odd natural history collections versus curiosities of decorative arts and
Yeah,
man-made objects?
yeah. That's a very good question, and it's not easy to answer. So collecting monstrosities or collecting curious things has been around for a very long time. I mean, the Romans, everybody really, when you had something special, you collected it, and there are collections of these things in the Middle Ages and 13th and 12th century. However, the it grew tremendously at the end of the 15th century. And then this was the same time when the drawings which were made from them became then not independent, but pieces of art as well. So one of the nicest early examples is the large grass from Dürer. So Dürer, we know nothing about Dürer's and cabinets of curiosity, but we know that he did animals like the hare, and he did the big turf. So at that time, it became independent. And in art history, as you know, it's mostly associated with Dürer and landscape and naturalism. But I think it has a lot to do with the collections they had. And my personal theory is that Dürer also knew about that. For instance, when he was in the Netherlands, he reported about what he saw at that time, and it was curiosity. I saw this bed where 50 men could sleep in, and I saw the zoo, and I saw a landscape, and I saw a whale, and I saw a wonderful painting from the Limburg brothers. So this combination of how you look at the world in combination with more and more objects which were available, I think this happened around 1500. And then it went into different directions. Then we had royal collections, which were growing. We had the Fugger collection, but we also had a lot of private collections. And I don't think that we can generalize about these collections. You were asking about the pieces of art, about these wonderful drawings. So this is a very interesting phenomenon because I mentioned this in my last lecture. In the 15th century, the wonderful paintings of flowers were still within a landscape. They were still incorporated in the painting. So I think this is something towards science, that you take the object out of the surroundings and you have drawings which are just the isolated object. And then you combine different objects on the same page by similarity or by other criteria you're using. And this is something which really happened around, I would say, 1520, 1530, 1550s. And then all these collections started. They started for flowers. So flowers were really most important. We have also wonderful examples of animals. This is how it started then, that the collections were the real objects, but you could have at the same time, it was easier to handle drawings of the object. And we discussed very briefly, sorry, I'll stop in a moment. We discussed during the last lecture, the problem of color, of authentic colors. You know, when you do flowers like this, I mean, you really, if you want to compare them, if you want to do scientific analysis, you have to be sure that you're not using yellow color for a flower which is actually violet and things like that. So this was a serious problem, and also the translation of the names was a serious problem. So all of a sudden, a lot of epistemological problems arose when you were dealing with these drawings.
Wonderful. Any other comments or questions for Dr. Haller?
Just one question.
Sure, Daphne, go ahead.
Dr. Haller, do you have any collections?
Yes, but sorry, I hadn't, not that I'm aware.
Books. Books.
I just started to think about that. Yes, I have a collection in Hanover, our house. We have we have a big basement and we have different rooms in the basement. So actually it's not like a dungeon. So I have a very nice collection of old computers from the early 80s into the late 90s. I have, as every scientist should have, a collection of books, but otherwise, no. I'm not collecting. Sometimes I think, well, that's a pity, but no, I don't.
I think we should ask Ute that question. Just
Thank you.
Just kidding. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. This was a really fun conversation. I loved it, and I hope you'll join us next month. We have a bit of a shift for our Science Cafe. We'll be back to Science Cafes on March 10th, I believe, and we are going to have a conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Marnick, who some of you may know from the MDI Biolab, but she's also a very prominent online presence. She's known as Science Liz Wiz if you are on social media. And she's going to be joined by a colleague, Melanie Tracek King. She is the co-creator and founder at Thinking is Power. And they are going to be talking to us about a very timely subject of how to deal with pseudoscience in the classroom. So both are very, very talented science communication experts. And so it should be a wonderful conversation. And I hope that you will all join us. And in the meantime, stay warm if you're here in the Northeast. We're having a lovely, messy snowstorm today and some others scheduled for the weekend. But other than that, enjoy. Spring's coming, the day's getting longer, and soon we will be with you all in person this summer for our Science Cafes. But thank you, Dr. Haller, so much for a really great presentation tonight.
Thank you. It was a very nice conversation and discussion. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone.